Greetings from Park City. Today I want to talk a bit about why great thinkers are not great scholars. And this insight occurred to me while I was interviewing Brian Leiter at UChicago. And Leiter mentioned how Heidegger misinterpreted Nietzsche and misinterpreted the entire philosophical tradition that came before him as well. And what was really interesting about Leiter's comments is that Heidegger's misinterpretation of the philosophical tradition is not incidental to his own philosophy. It wasn't detrimental to his own philosophy, but it was demanded by it. Because it was only by misinterpreting all the thinkers that came before him could he read the philosophical tradition as culminating into his own work, right? And once Leiter pointed that out to me, I started noticing how many of the great minds that we would consider to be great thinkers are actually terrible scholars. That they fall short of the scholarly conventions we hold people to today. And so one example of this is Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche himself is infamously uncharitable to the thinkers that he's attacking. Girard, in Battling to the End, takes on a very uncharitable reading of Hegel to prove his own point. But the real kicker for me is St. Augustine. So Augustine, as we all know, is famous for combining the Platonic Greek tradition, right, with Christianity. How many works of Plato has Augustine read in the original Greek? There's a genuine debate about this, but many scholars think that he's only read the Timaeus in ancient Greek, not because his Greek was bad, but just because of the lack of availability. Now, Augustine did read a lot of secondary literature on Plato, right, through Plotinus and these other great Neoplatonists. But I still think it's quite crazy that the guy who combined Platonism with Christianity possibly could have only read one of Plato's dialogues, and a not too essential dialogue at that. That would be like today if I combine Hegel with the Chinese tradition, and the only Hegel I've ever read is the preface to the Phenomenology, the preface to the Philosophy of Right, and all the books by Robert Pippin and Axel Honneth. Okay, that's the kind of oddity that we are talking about here. And so the obvious question is, why is this, right? Why is there such a break between great thinkers and great scholars? And I think the reason is because what the thinker is doing is a fundamentally different type of activity than the scholar. The thinker is in the business of paradigm shifts, of creating these fundamentally new modes of thought that break from the previous tradition. And in order to engender these paradigm shifts, it is often necessary to distort the thinking and the thoughts that have come before them. And so one of my favorite essays by Nietzsche, it's called The Uses and Abuses of History for Life. And he talks about how forgetting, the capacity of forgetting, is an important prerequisite to action. What I think Nietzsche had in mind in that essay was more about how forgetting is important for worldly action, right? So if I am a wannabe Alexander, if I want to be a great man, I should just think about history as a series of monumental great men, one after the other. I should forget all the inconvenient facts about all the suffering that they bring and how Alexander died as a young man drunk, how Caesar was stabbed. And that kind of forgetting, that kind of distorting one's life and ignoring the truth almost is important for worldly action. I think we can probably extend that intuition, surprisingly, and say that even in the realm of thought, even in the realm of truth, forgetting, ignoring, distorting is important for world historic activity. One of my teachers, Mark Lilla, once wrote that scholars, careful scholars, who come up with multi-causal explanations for things and use words like that are easily forgotten. But great thinkers who find in one single idea, right, like Girard and Mimesis, the hidden wellspring to explain everything, right, a theory of everything, they're worshipped, they're ridiculed, but they're never ignored. And so That's why I think the thinker is so different from the scholar, is that it's precisely by being uncareful, by perhaps being untruthful, by being forgetful, that they become great thinkers that introduce new paradigm shifts. And so perhaps an analogy would be helpful here, which is the thinker is to the scholar what the conqueror is to the gardener, right? So the conqueror conquers vast swaths of territory. I think Genghis Khan, but much of that territory is in shambles. Some of it is on fire. Some of it is in open rebellion. Now the gardener does not have a vast swath, an endless empire, an empire without an end. But what little domain he does have, what inconsequential sort of land he does have, he is able to be the most meticulous in arranging it in the proper way possible. And in the same way, it's the willingness of the conqueror to commit violence upon others, right? To subject others to the sword. It's exactly the same willingness to commit violence on the text of others that makes the thinker the thinker. And so that's why I think the thinker and the scholar are two fundamentally different types of people. And I find it somewhat humorous that no literature professor confuses himself with Shakespeare. But many philosophy professors, philosophy scholars, they don't confuse themselves with Plato, but they think they're doing the same kind of activity as Plato. Whereas my intuition is that it's actually radically different as a literary critic's activity is to Shakespeare's activity. Okay, obvious question is, which one should we be? Or which one do I want to be? Personally, I think I have the intuitions of both. On one hand, I think it's very glorious to be a thinker, right? A world historic thinker. I still can't forget the lines at the end of Ovid's Metamorphosis, where he says, wherever Rome shall extend her reach, my name will never leave men's lips. Or Dante, when he's in, I think it's Canto 5 in the Inferno, when he's at Limbo, and he's surrounded by all the great poets of antiquity. There's Virgil and Homer and Horace, Lucan, Ovid, and he says, for greater glory was than mine. I was invited to join their ranks. I was sixth among such intellects. And there's something so attractive and glorious about being a world historic thinker. I think it's an act of conquest, perhaps even greater than that of worldly conquest, the Alexanders of the world. So I definitely do, I definitely feel pulled by that, but I'm also extremely, my tendencies are much more of a scholar's tendencies. My entire project is trying to interpret and study the great books, right? It's trying to interpret the classics and not to come up, at least not yet, with my own ideas. But after consideration, I think both paths must be rejected, and that it's fine if you end up a great scholar or a great thinker, but to have either one as your end, I think is perverted. Because I think the end product of philosophy should be a great life. It should be about living. And so instead of a great thinker or a great scholar, one ought be a great liver, right? Someone who lives a great life. And if that life demands to produce an important books or to do scholarship, then so be it. But to either be a great thinker or scholar as an end goal, I think is radically perverse and a betrayal of what philosophy should be about. And so the models I have in mind are people who never intended to be great thinkers to begin with. And you can see that by the fact that they never intended to write any books. People like Epictetus, Confucius, Socrates, Jesus, Buddha, they were just all about living a good life, helping a political community live a good life in the case of Socrates and Confucius. And they happened to become great thinkers. I think that's the kind of life worthy of philosophy. Okay, those are my very brief thoughts on this distinction between the scholar and the thinker. I'll see you guys next time.